400 years ago, the inhabitants of the Pennsylvania region were a group of Native Americans known as the Shawnee Indians. The Shawnee lived in the Ohio and Pennsylvania region for a very long time until the Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced them to move westward to places like Kansas and Oklahoma. The Shawnee Indians are what is called an autonomous people. Autonomous means that each tribe has its own government, laws, and services just like its own little country, although they still must follow U.S. law above all else. Shawnee Indians were fantastic scientists for their time. They utilized astronomy for direction and the changing of the seasons, and they used biology to create the plant food we know as corn. Most importantly, the Shawnee were a very sustainable people. They utilized everything in their environment to survive in a world much different than today. Since there weren't many articles on kindergartners' misconceptions of Native Americans and their environment, I decided to ask my students myself. As it turns out, my class believes that Native Americans no longer exist. When I asked more in-depth questions to my students, they came up with some very interesting answers. When asked where Native Americans lived, they said, in RVs in the woods, and another child confidently exclaimed that they built giant sandcastles and lived in them with their families. When asked what Native Americans ate, they said they ate animals. Since this was a very good answer, I asked what kind of animals they would have eaten, and my classroom responded with monkeys. Finally, when I asked my class what Native Americans wore, they explained that they think Native Americans wore hats with a lot of feathers and sweaters with feathers on them. Although it's thought of as the typical Native American dwelling, Shawnee Indians did not live in teepees. They lived in round dwellings called wigwams. Wigwams were typically 8 to 10 feet tall and woven from birch bark. What makes wigwams different from teepees are the curved surfaces which allow the shelters to hold up against the poor weather in the winter. The skeletal frame of the wigwam is usually made of 10 to 15 foot long saplings, and then the frame is covered with birch bark. Today, Shawnee families usually reside in the Oklahoma region and live in houses just like you and me. Many of the Shawnees still have very strong ties to their culture and ancestors, regardless of their living location. When European settlers came over to America in the 1600s, they brought horses with them. These horses were the Shawnees' main source of transportation. Along with the horses was transportation over the waterways in the Pennsylvania region. To cover these large distances, the Shawnee would hollow out large trees around their villages and use them as canoes. The wood that wasn't used on the canoes would go towards firewood or the creation of various tools and weapons. Along with the Earth's resources, the Shawnee also used astronomy principles that we use in society today to navigate around their land and to interact with other Native American tribes. Along with being basic hunter-gatherers, the Shawnee were also farming people. Amazingly, even 500 years ago, the Shawnee used the planets, stars, and position of objects in the sky to determine when to farm. A little known fact is that the Native Americans actually invented the thing we know as corn today. They crossbred wild grass known as teosinte. They cultivated and protected the species, which is such an integral part of our agricultural society today. The Shawnee women planted corn and squash, while the men hunted deer, turkey, and went fishing. The Shawnee used these ingredients to create delicious stews and soup. The sustainability of the Shawnee was evident in their clothing too. All of the game that they killed for food was used for clothing or building around the village. The Shawnee men wore leggings or things called breechclouts, which closely resembled loincloths. Women wore leggings and skirts, but both wore moccasins on their feet. Although Native Americans are typically pictured as wearing very large, elaborate headdresses, the most the Shawnee would wear was a headband with a feather or two on it. Although shirts were not necessary in the Shawnee culture, both men and women wore ponchos in cool weather. All of these articles of clothing were made from the cured hides of animals that the men hunted for food, and the feathered headdresses were usually made from the feathers of hunted turkey. In today's society, we strive to be as sustainable as the Shawnee, but we come up very short. The Shawnee were experts at living off of the land and utilizing all that their environment had to offer. They used every part of the animals they killed, the land they cultivated, and the agricultural resources that they collected. From creating shelter, transportation, growing and finding food, and creating clothing and tools, the Shawnee were experts at living off of the land. In today's society, we outsource most of the things we need. We go to supermarkets and fast food chains for our food, and shopping malls for our clothes. We live in houses that are far too big for us, and we drive cars that damage our environment every time we put our foot on the gas pedal. The Shawnee people produced no carbon footprint and followed the principle of 7-generation sustainability. This means that each generation treated the land with care and respect so that even 7 generations later, their future people would be able to live sustainably. Unfortunately, as of today, the state of Pennsylvania creates the third most air pollution in the entire country. There is a huge problem with abandoned mine drainage, and due to a large amount of farmland, there's pollution in pesticide and fertilizer use. This is a habit that cannot continue if we are to ensure a healthy environment for our 7th generation.